In the previous chapter, we focused on image textures, and now it's time to know a little more about procedural texturing. As we said earlier, procedural textures are made using math formulas instead of pictures. This method gives you more control and flexibility because you can change the look of the texture by adjusting the settings. The big advantage of procedural texture is that it can be zoomed in without losing the quality, and they are seamless, so you can really see the visible edges of the texture. Of course, you can make your image texture look seamless too, but it takes way more time as they are not designed to be repeated like the procedural textures. For some of the cases, I presented the textures along with a mapping node to present it better and also to show you how you can actually see it, because sometimes default options are not the optimal ones. Now let's take a look at the procedural textures we have in Blender. The brick texture creates a pattern that looks like a brick wall. This texture is useful for making buildings, paths, and other brick-like surfaces. We can easily customize it to get the look we want. We can change the brick's color and they will be blended to create different shades of two colors to add some variety. Mortar color, scale of the bricks, mortar size and smoothness, bias of the colors, and lastly width and height of the bricks. The offset option allows to create the random variations of the pattern with different brick positions based on the first frequency value, and squash resize the nth row based on the corresponding frequency value below. With the mortar smoothness set to something above 0, we can use a factor output to connect it to the bump map and then to Principled Shader's normal input to achieve a nice 3D brick effect. Checker texture creates a pattern of alternating squares like a chessboard or checkerboard. This texture is useful for creating floors, tiles, and other surfaces that need a simple repeating pattern. You can change both of the colors and the scale of the checkers. We can also change the rotation with the mapping node to achieve a diamond-like pattern. We can stretch it a little bit in y-axis, and here we go, a simple diamond pattern. Gradient creates a gradient from the left to right if connected to the generated texture coordinates, or starting on the center with object coordinates. We can change the type, and these options will change the look of the gradient, starting with linear to spherical or radial. With the mapping node, we can perform all the basic transforms and have the control of the look of the gradient. If we want to change the color of our gradients, we can use the color ramp node and add as many colors as we like. Magic texture creates colorful, abstract patterns that look psychedelic and random. To be honest, I'm not using it too often, maybe just the factor output, but we can definitely make some psychedelic animations with this one. We can override the color by using color ramp and change the depth of the texture along with scale and even more distortion as if the default one wasn't crazy enough. Noise is another really powerful texture that has a lot of options to change. While creating realistic materials, it helps with achieving a more natural and less uniform look of the material if used properly. We can choose if the noise should be generated in 1, 2, or 3D, adding more complexity to the texture with each dimension. If we select a 4D dimension, we will also see the new W option, and we can use it for volumetrics, and we'll talk about it in a minute. The detail adjusts the level of detail in the noise pattern. Higher values add more complexity and fine features, making the texture look more complex. The roughness adjusts the texture's level of detail and complexity. This parameter controls how smooth or rough the noise appears by determining how many smaller noise patterns are layered onto the main noise. Lower values are useful for creating simpler, more uniform textures. The higher values can be used for very detailed surfaces. like unariety, controls the gap size between the layers of detail in the noise pattern. Lower values make the noise appear smoother, and higher values add even more variation. Distortion modifies the noise pattern by introducing warping or twisting effects. This makes the texture appear less uniform and more natural. On top of all that, we can also change the type of the noise. The default FBM type might be used for natural terrains or clouds. Multifractal is similar to FBM but has a stronger contrast. Ridged and hybrid multifractal as well as heteroterrain are great for terrain generation to simulate mountains or cliffs and natural landscapes. We can customize different options for specific types of noise too, which makes it probably the most complex texture type. Voronoi texture creates patterns that look like irregular cells or tiles. These patterns form around specific points, making each cell closer to one point than any other nearby point. This gives a natural, organic appearance to the pattern it generates. In my opinion, the second most versatile and complex texture. With the amount of options to change, you can create totally different looking textures. The feature output option changes how the texture calculates distances between points thanks to what the overall pattern is changing. The distance metric defines how distances between points are calculated, which impacts the shape and appearance of the cells. The Minkowski method is really nice. It creates star-like pattern if the random value is bigger than 0. You probably noticed that with every method and feature output, some options are different, similarly to the noise texture, and try to change them to see what's going to happen. Wave texture creates patterns that look like repeating gradients or stripes. This texture is useful for materials like water, wood grain, or other surfaces that need a wavy pattern. We will use it for creating procedural sand to make it more irregular and dune-like. We can customize it to get the look we want by changing the wave type, direction of the rings or bands, and scale. Distortion and detail options allow us to add more complexity to the texture, along with the detail roughness amount, which fine-tunes the shape of the gradient even more. The wave profile adjusts the look of the gradient. With the default one, it repeats smoothly. Saw is cutting the gradient when it reaches the white value and repeats it from the black. And triangle, which changes linearly from black to white and then back to black. White noise texture creates a random pattern which each pixel is a different value, like static on a TV screen. This texture is useful for creating random variations and noise effects. We can also use it for blurring textures with linear light mode and keeping the image seamless, as we don't have any texture blurring nodes in Blender, and this texture on its own is not really useful. Let's use this grid texture to see how we can blur it. So we won't actually blur the pixels themselves, but the coordinates. Random color of noise mixed using linear light blending with UV or generated coordinates and plugged into the vector of our texture gives us a blurry result. We can see that bringing the factor value above 0.3 starts to make the texture gray, so we can plug the map range node to the factor and set the 2 max value to 0.3. Now we can just go between the 0 and 0.3 range. Now, let's see what else we can do with these textures. I prepared a scene with a few interesting textures to show how they will behave when used as a volumetric density. You probably remember that we had to set a pretty high value to a density to actually see anything, so for all of them I multiplied the input by a value above 100 using a math node. We can plug each texture to the volume density input, but here are a few most interesting, starting with checker texture. The setup here is pretty standard, but changing a few things in the volume shader makes things look better. Everywhere where the texture is black, there is no volume, and where the texture is white, there is the full density of the volume. Next up, we have a Voronoi texture. I created two color ramps, one that is responsible for the density and the second for the emission strength on the edges of these floating parts. I added the value to multiply the emission strength and I animated it, and we have this interesting effect. It's a little bit blurry because of the speed of the animation, but after rendering it should look really nice. Let's stop the animation for a while and let our computers rest. Next texture is a noise texture. In 3D it looks like a paint splash or a fluid trapped in the box. But let's slowly change the V value. We can see that now the texture is changing not only on the surface, but the whole volume is morphing. So the 4D option was probably designed especially for this kind of animation. And of course, you can animate this value instead of changing it by hand. Wave texture also looks interesting as a volume. We can play with the distortion and phase offset, and we're getting really nice abstract results. And the next one, my favorite, another noise texture with different settings but with a similar setup as the Voronoi texture. Two color ramps, one for volume density, one for emission density, animated W value, and the emission strength, and we have a really abstract and interesting cloud-like creation. Let's play the animation. I'm sure you will find used to it. And the last one, mix of the Voronoi stars and noise texture. As with normal textures, you can add a few procedural textures too, and then mix them as volumetric shaders as I did here, or with a mix color node. Mesmerizing and really relaxing to make. Rendering those volumes? Not so much, but still it's worth it. And it's all procedural. So in this lesson we've learned about different texture types, and now it's time to use them in some materials. We will start with procedural dust and dirt.